Well, welcome back, man. We have gotten all kinds of comments, but mostly on our hair, because this is going to be called the hairdo episode, the pandemic hairdo episode. I want this happened back in the flu of 1918, the Spanish.
Yeah, except for they didn't have Zoom meetings then, but yeah, but I bet they did have different hairdos. But the good news is we're getting our haircut next week, right?
Yeah, I am, man. Unless we go back into phase -1 or whatever it is. Okay.
Right.
Anyway, so I'm Richard Adams. I'm your resident interviewer, historian. Are your phones off, folks? Make sure your phones are off. Here we go. Okay. And we got a lot of comments on this, and a lot of good comments. People seem to enjoy the historical, I don't know what to call it, trivia or not, but it's kind of trivia.
Ramblings, historic ramblings.
Ramblings, yeah. And so our first request came from Brian Buchanan, who I know is a guitar player, singer, songwriter, and band director. And his family's really into history. They are all into the B&O railroad line. That's all his wife's people. And anyway, it goes on. But his request was about Augusta Springs, and I used to be the counselor at Craigsville Elementary School, and I would drive by Augusta Springs every day and wave to the Knights and all the people that live out there. And so Nancy, tell these people about Augusta Springs, Virginia.
All right. Well, first, if you want to go out and see sort of the shadows of this history, go out to the Augusta Springs wetlands, which is a part of the George Washington National Forest now. There's a nice nature trail there, a little less than a mile long, includes a boardwalk through the actual wetlands. And the trail takes you through the ruins of this resort complex that was once there. You'll see some foundations of the different buildings. There was once a big hotel. There was a fountain. The spring itself with a little bit of a foundation around it. You'll see remnants of the different buildings, including where the water was bottled that we're going to be talking about. So, plus you'll see a lot of neat wildlife. So I would highly recommend you go out there. And the governor says that we need to get out and exercise and get out in the great outdoors. And so go out there and do it. So Augusta Springs, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I'm just going to say how to get there, because you have to ride there every day. First of all, I went by Hardee's and got an egg and cheese biscuit in Stanton. And then I went up the old Parkersburg Pike, which is 254, which I guess started in Waynesboro. I think it started in Waynesboro. It's the road that.
Well, the Parkersburg Pike goes from Stanton to Parkersburg. And,
Parkersburg, West Virginia, which would have been.
Yeah, and if you go to Parkersburg, West Virginia, it's called the Stanton Pike.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so Parkersburg, West Virginia is up on the north on the Ohio River, up in the northern part of, it's right on Interstate 77, and probably some other major road like the Parkersburg Pike. Anyway, but you go out, you go past Buffalo Gap High School, you go through the little valley there, the Buffalo Gap Valley, and then you run into, as soon as you get phone service again, you're in Augusta Springs. All right.
You take 42. Once you get out to Buffalo Gap High School, you get on 42.
Right, which is both. It's 254 and 42.
Yeah, well, but 42 is the key here, because 42 was once called the Harrisonburg to Warm Springs Turnpike, and it went from Harrisonburg all the way to Warm Springs, and the purpose of it really was to get people out to the big resorts out there, what we call the homestead now, but Hot Springs and Warm Springs, because those springs attracted, since the first settlers, those springs have attracted people to soak in the waters. It was a health thing. Probably if they'd had a pandemic, they would have told people to go out to the springs and soak and try to recover their health. So people soaked in the waters, or they drank the waters, and it was considered very healthy and invigorating. And but those were the biggies. But this whole valley is part of a geology that we call karst geology, which means that we're underlain by limestone. It's kind of like Swiss cheese underneath our feet, because when it rains, acids seep through the ground and eat through that limestone, and so you get caverns, caves, sinkholes, and limestone outcroppings, and lots of springs. And so there were resort springs where people would come to for health and relaxation. everywhere. Augusta County and Rockingham County and Rockbridge County had dozens and dozens of them. Some of them were, have long faded into memory, just, a few pages in the history book. And some of them, like Hot Springs and Warm Springs, are still going strong. But in the time where we didn't have much medicinal hope, we didn't have vaccines that we're trying to develop, but we didn't have antibiotics. Sometimes these springs were the only way that people could hope to regain their health from whatever reasons. And they all had it. Some of them were warm or hot, as in Hot Springs or Warm Springs. Some of them had special minerals in them, like sulfur or lithium salts, that people thought had some curative powers. So as you go out through 42, you hit a lot of these springs before you get to the biggies out in Bath County. Right when you get to that stretch of what's now Craigsville, Augusta Springs, there were 3 springs right in a row there. There was one at, it was called Mount Elliott Springs, or Farrell, that little village of Farrell. And then the next one was Augusta Springs, or some people called it Pond Gap. And then there was a 3rd spring in Craigsville. So those springs kind of developed into their own little resort things, especially the one at Pond Gap that became called Augusta Springs. And it wasn't hot, it wasn't warm, but it did have lithium salts in it. And lithium salts were considered something to cure, among other things, blood pressure. And so a lot of people would take these lithium salt, the water, because it had these salts in it, for curative purposes, but it was also very pure water. And in the time before chlorine had been invented to purify water, city water, if you lived in Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. or New York City, you didn't really want to drink the water because it was nasty. People's sewers dumped into it, and they had no way to purify it. So waters at places like Augusta Springs were considered incredibly pure with no organic matter in them, and they were bottled and shipped to the big city. And so this Augusta Springs became kind of a dual resort where people could go and visit, drink the waters, relax, at this nice fancy hotel, but also the water was bottled and shipped into the big cities. And it was called Augusta Springs White Lithia water.
When would this have been?
This would have been the late 1800s. So the turnpike brought people there first, and then the railroad, the what became the C&O Railroad, or CSX as we know it now, made it out there before the Civil War, and then just improved tremendously after the war. So the heyday would have been the last 25 years of the 1800s, and then the water bottling continued into the early 1900s.
All right. So, and that railroad doesn't go to Hot Springs. It goes on down to Clifton Forge, right?
Yeah. But it had a stop at Augusta Springs, Pond Gap, and people would get off there. They'd either come in by stagecoach or carriage, or they'd come, as the railroad became more and more popular, they'd come by railroad and then be met at the depot. And I think I sent you a picture of the Augusta Springs depot that you could put up when you're editing this. But they would be met at the depot by a carriage and just taken a quarter of a mile away to this maple tree lined driveway that went into this grand hotel. And they would, in the carriage, they would have all their luggage and everything that they just unloaded from the train, and they'd stay there, walk the grounds, relax, drink the water. There was a 1-lane bowling alley there, so they might go bowling, and it was just a way to. And this would have been for rich people, so it
Kinda
was
like
a way. Like us.
Yeah. I mean, look at that.
Yeah, look at this, and this program that we're doing for nothing. Yeah, that's how we're getting rich, right? So we can go out to Augusta Springs or the Homestead.
Sponsored by Augusta. This is sponsored by the mineral waters of Augusta Springs.
Right. So if anybody else wants to sponsor us, please let us know. Anyway, so it had its heyday in the late 1800s, And then just after 1900, it was actually purchased by a rich man. Last name was Pendleton, and it became his like private place. But but he continued to make some money and get richer, I guess, by bottling the water and shipping it in these gallon and a half clear bottles to the big city and sell it. And I should pause at this point and say that most of what I've learned about Augusta Springs comes from the world's leading experts, or Buck and Julie Kent, and they live in Augusta Springs, and they lived there for 40 or more years, raised their family there, and they have made it their life's work to learn everything they can about the springs. And so they and collected incredible photographs. They have the only known advertising poster of Augusta Springs, which is a pretty interesting poster. They found it underneath some wallpaper in a local house, and they've
really,
and it's just about falling apart. It's very fragile, but it is this giant poster of this very alluring woman laying on a couch, and it's advertising. I've got the description of what it says. See if I can find it here. Oh yes. So Augusta White Lithia water, the purest spring water known on the American and European continents, carrying only 4.5 grains of inorganic saline substances to the imperial gallon, no organic matter. And this woman is surrounded by all these Ivy League symbols. So that tells you sort of who the audience was. It wasn't you or me. It was people from the uppity ups from Princeton and Harvard and places like that. So they also have some of the bottles and some photographs, because the resort springs catered to rich people coming in, but there was always, because of the water here, there was always industry here, and there was always some industrial activity happening in the Craigsville, Augusta Springs area for the local people to work at. So Augusta Springs was known for years and years and years for its tanyard, Kunkel Tannery, and that's where you make leather. You bring in, you get bark, and you strip off bark, and you soak it, and you get these tannic acids, and you turn these old nasty animal hides into leather, and it's a real stinky, nasty process. The rich people weren't involved in that. The local people working there were involved in that, and there was quite a thriving tannery until about 1900, and it burned down. It was replaced in the 1920s by the Stillwater textile mill, and that operated until just a few, maybe 10 years or so ago, and then went out of business. So it was a big, thriving community. You think of Augusta Springs and Craigsville and that area as being sort of in the middle of nowhere, and why would people want to live out there? Well, one thing, it's beautiful out there, but another thing is there was work, and there was a lot of work. This tannery,
concrete factory was in
in Craigsville was a huge concrete factory, and so there were hundreds of people employed here. There were prosperous schools and villages. Augusta Springs at one time had like 3 churches and stores and post office and school. It was a thriving little community. And another person, Howard McNeil, who I interviewed, who was born there like in 1951. His father worked at Stillwater, and his grandparents farmed there, and he grew up there, and he said it's the most wonderful place. It was like Mayberry. He said it was like grew up in Mayberry, and so it was a nice place. It had transportation connections with the railroad, and it had employment, and so these were prosperous, thriving communities. So Augusta Springs was known variously as Augusta Springs and Pond Gap, and so that's sort of the origins in a nutshell there.
What so you go down what's now 42, we'll call it,
right?
And I think there's an old. Did that kind of veer to the left, or is that the
original? Yeah, if you veer to the left, you get kind of the main village.
Right, the road's still there, right?
The road's still there, and you can drive around and see some of the houses. There's some some pretty fancy houses, and then some working class houses that are all still there. They're not three churches anymore. One of the, I guess, the death knells of Augusta Springs was, of course, Stillwater closing up hurt a lot. But in, May 4th, 1990, so almost exactly 30 years ago, they had a major tornado that went through there.
I remember that tornado.
Yes, an F2 tornado that killed 2 people and injured 10 others. But it did a lot of damage, property damage to the community, and kind of hit a mental blow to the community as well. But one of the things it did was the Presbyterian Church. It lifted the Presbyterian Church up off its foundation and dropped it back down and tilted it. And so there was no repairs that could be done to the church, and they had to burn the church down.
Yeah.
And this Mr. McNeil, who I interviewed, who was baptized in the church, carried to the church on a pillow as a newborn and baptized, and grew up in the church. He said that the day that they burned that church down was the day that broke his heart, and it maybe kind of sent a dagger into the heart of the community as well.
Anyway, take me on a visual tour of the wetlands. And is that a state park? Is that a federal park?
Well, no, it's part of the George Washington National Forest.
Okay.
So that's
federal.
That's federal. It's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and so it's just a sort of a subset of that. There's a little parking area. Doesn't cost anything to go in. You park there and you just walk around, and there's a walking trail. And so when you walk in, you kind of walk along what was you'll see the remnants of the maple trees that once lined the fancy driveway, and you'll walk up to the as I said, you're going to go counterclockwise. So you'll start sort of veering to your right, and you'll go down the driveway, and there's boardwalks and places to sit, board benches, and then on your right you'll see a circular area of stones that was once the fountain. And if you can imagine, right in front of that, so you'd be facing what was once the Grand Hotel, and then you'll walk a little bit further and off to a little bit to the left of that circular fountain is the spring itself. It's a beautiful, beautiful spring, kind of a rocky outcropping, and then there's some people who've worked some limestone and kind of created a little basin for it to stay in, and then it kind of runs out from there in a little trough. You can keep following around, then you start veering to the left, going up a hill a little bit, and you'll see some stone foundations that are some of the things like the stables and the outbuildings. If you look up to your right, there's a hillside. There used to be a chapel on top of the hill. The chapel's no longer there. Some of these buildings succumb to fire, and others just decay and were pulled down. But up at the chapel, there's actually a little grave up there. If you walk up the hill there, if you continue going sort of counterclockwise to your left, you'll cross a big boardwalk through a very large wetlands where you'll see lots of waterfowl. It's beautiful to go there in the winter, where you can see kind of a rim of ice on it and some of the winter animals. And a cool thing to do there in February is if you go through the wetlands and kind of around the trail to the backside, there's kind of a seep where the wetlands kind of ooze out there into a little swampy area. And there's a plant there that's called skunk cabbage. In the summer, it's a great big leafy thing, looks like a giant cabbage or lettuce leaves. But in February is when the skunk cabbage blooms, and it's just a tiny little pinkish kind of pink and green kind of spire that pokes out of the ground through the mud and the water and the ice. And when it blooms, it exudes, it radiates heat. And so it melts all the ice and the snow that might be around it. So you can find it if you're lucky. There's been a cold snap, or a little bit of snow, and then you'll see all these little flowers poking up out of the snow with little circles where it's melted right around them, and then it emits a scent that the pollinators come in and get. But it has to melt the snow and the ice to get it out, and so it's really fun to go out and try to find some of these skunk cabbage plants. Then you'll keep going around. Almost at the end, you'll see a kind of a cement slab area. That was the bottling plant. Nothing left there but the cement slab, but people have observed, I haven't been lucky enough to see this, but there's a bird called a woodcock that does this incredible mating dance in the spring, and they'll fly straight up in the air and then zoom down to try to impress. The guys will try to do that to impress the girls, and they do this mating dance. They use that cement block as their dance floor, I guess, and you'll see the woodcocks there and doing that dance. So it's a nice hike. I recommend people get out and do it, and remember the history when they're there.
Did the hotel or motel burn down?
Yeah, I think it did. I think the hotel did burn down eventually. There was another hotel just up the road at Farrell or Elliott Springs as well, and I think most of these hotels ended up burning. The tannery burned down too. Fire was especially when you had to heat with wood, was always a danger. So.
And just to get it straight, so as you're going from, say, Buffalo Gap High School, we go through that little valley. Is Farrell first?
Farrell's first, and there's actually a little pond there still. It's a private house, and
is it on the right or the left?
It's on the right as you're heading west. Okay. As you're heading west, Farrell's first with a little pond, and then you'll see Augusta Springs, and then you'll eventually end up very quickly into Craigsville. So, and Augusta Springs, so at the wetlands, you kind of had to go off. If you want to see the village itself, you have to go off to the left. And the community there has built a nice, with Augusta County's help, they've built a nice little playground that kids can go out and the community kids can go out and play on.
Okay. What is that valley called?
I don't know. Does it have a name?
I don't know. I know the Esteline Valley is to the left.
Yeah, and then there's Bells Valley. So I don't know. We'd have to look on the map or we need to ask some of the locals. Who's the guy that you said told you about this in the first place? He could tell you.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, we'll put this, it'll be on the emails. Where are they at? The emails,
right.
You can email us.
Emails right down there. Yeah, right email us and tell us.
They can be over here this time. We have to wait and see how this thing lines up.
But you have to send us we're always part of doing this is learning more, and so you all who have grown up in these areas and know can fill us in and maybe send us more pictures. That'd be cool. I've got some great pictures of the Augusta Springs baseball team. Every community had a baseball team at that time, and so anything you can tell us to fill in the story, it just makes us all richer for it. So we look forward to hearing more about what you might know about Augusta Springs or Farrell or the Resort Springs in Craigsville, because this is a part of our past. I mean, the springs in our area that's why people came here, and they came here to take the waters.
So next time I get held up on 81 by a sinkhole, I'll think about the karst in this area. So yeah.
That's right. Just think about just like I said, imagine Swiss cheese underneath your feet. And you don't know when you're going to drop into a sinkhole sometime. So
I've heard the stories about the farmers that lost cows in the sinkholes.
Definitely, and that's continuing to this day. I've known a few farmers who lost cows in the last year or so. There was one out in that area, I think more toward Churchville area, that lost a cow for days, and then they discovered
it. Sounds like this, right? Like,
yeah.
That's what it sounds.
Yeah. But that's a whole nother video about livestock in the area.
So just to look to the future here, you had to do that in pandemics or you'll drive yourself crazy and your hair will look like this. So we've had a request for Newport.
Newport.
We had there's something out there. Kind
So
of
if these things ring a bell with anybody and they say, "Oh, I know a lot about Newport," send them to us, so we can highlight them and on the email. Yes, send them to us, and we'll certainly send us places you want to learn about too.
Yeah, and let's start doing some fake sponsors. You ready?
Okay.
You never know, somebody may pull up to I would say Peck's, home of the $4.95 half chicken plate in the iced tea. And anyway, with two sides, the place is crazy, man. It's busy out there. But I think this crowd probably goes there, and it's kind of like the places that are busy, like Wright's Dairy Right.
Wright's Dairy Right, yeah.
Yeah, and anyway, so this week we'll be in the Edelweiss restaurant where there's
we've actually gone to all those places and gotten pandemic food. Edelweiss, you can get we get a meal, 2 meals, and then we get some extra sides like extra red cabbage. That's the best.
Like
so
Ralphie had on A Christmas Story.
We get a quart of red cabbage to go with us. So
yeah, just a little trivia there, but Ralphie on The Christmas Story, the BB gun, Red Ryder BB gun.
Right.
I went to his house. You can go to Cleveland, Ohio, and go to Ralphie's house. Some guy bought it, and they've restored it completely. And so you can go take your picture of all the the stove, the leg lamp. It's all there. So, and they bought the Farkas's house. So if you're in Cleveland, and what you do is you go get on 254-42, and you go through Augusta Springs, Farrell, Augusta Springs, Craigsville. Just keep going. Stay on the same road. Go to Parkersburg, take a right on 77, and go up there, and then ask somebody, and they'll tell you. Parkersburg's home of the onion and mustard hamburger. So
there you go. So you've got all these little bits of trivia around the country. Like, did you know that Dr. Pepper was invented in Rural Retreat down in Southwest Virginia?
I knew that, but I'm a trivia.
But maybe other people didn't know that.
Yeah. Anyway, anything else? Yeah, we got the sewing machine, the Reaper, and then we got Dr. Pepper. You can't go wrong. I don't know what Mountain Dew had to be down there somewhere. So
yeah, I've heard about Mountain Dew. We'll have to figure that one out.
Pepsi was in North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina. Coca-Cola was in Atlanta. Coca-Cola.
Yeah. Or at least it's there now. That's its headquarters. So.
All right. Well, let's see here. What else you got to do today? You got to write a book or anything?
No, I'm going to keep working on my Vintage Valley sports pandemic pictures. So if anybody, I've been throwing those up on Augusta County Historical Society Facebook and running them in the News Virginian. So if anybody has sports pictures from the past and wants to highlight them, I think I'm working on 1930s Fishburne military track team. So we need to work on that. Go Fishburne.
I always wanted to be a pole vaulter, and here's I was 6'2", 220 in high school, offensive lineman, and a first trumpet player. And so I got down there and I said, I'm going to do this. It looks so cool, So I got that pole and I ran down probably very slowly, which is the speed I work at. And I planted that pole in there, and I got thinking, the only thing between me and the ground is this little skinny pole. And I just went, man, that was a dumb idea. So I went back to the shot put. It's much safer. Anyway. All right. And we are decided to dedicate this series to our hero, the late Mac Swift, Mac Swift. And we're going to put his picture up at the end here. But Mac was your teacher in high school.
Right. He was my teacher in high school, and I did my student teaching. I'm certified to teach history. So I returned and did my student teaching with Mac. So I got double Mac.
And Mac, and when I was the band director, and Mac was a former, this is great, Riverheads High School drama teacher,
and
football coach.
Yes.
He's from Hampton, Tennessee.
And of course, history teacher extraordinaire.
Yeah.
He did U.S. history and world history.
And so many people were inspired by Mac, and they would talk about him telling his stories because he would break it down and make it very, very user-friendly for the people that hated history. Mac was the guy. And I got to write a play with him, Spirit of Augusta, thanks to Nancy, in the 2007 Williamsburg 400-year anniversary.
Jamestown.
Yeah. Jamestown, excuse me, yeah.
Williamsburg too, but yeah.
Yeah. And we got to write this play, and it was just great. I just looked at Mac, and we met at Wright's Dairy Right, ordered some food, and I said, okay, you got the history, I got the music. And I said, and we literally sat down on the back of a hot dog paper and wrote the narration down. And I'm sure he didn't have to look up a thing. It was great. So.
Well, we could play that song, some of the songs sometimes. Spirit of Augusta.
I was playing one the other day. What else do you have to do in a pandemic?
But so Mac, let me just tell you how Mac taught history. I mean, the word history, if you look at it, his story, that was how Mac taught history, his stories. And I can still remember him talking about his one of his relatives who teaching us about the Model T Ford, and how his relative thought that when he got his Model T Ford that that the lines in the road, you should go down the center of them so you wouldn't fall off each side. So they would drive the car right up the center. And my husband can attest to this. Everybody at Riverheads High School can tell you who invented barbed wire. That was Joseph Glidden. Could probably even come up with a date if I thought long enough and hard enough about it, but that was because of the stories he told about barbed wire and how that opened up the West. But who would have thought that Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire? Maybe that's another story.
We got to do Newport, and we got to do Buena Vista. I'm still waiting for Buena Vista, so I've already got the opening theme set up. I mean, this is going to be a huge thing. So, all right, Nancy. Well, thank you for doing this again. This is Nancy Sorrells, MED. Do you have an MED in history? From what is your? Not
education. It's a master's in. It's called public history now, but when I got it, it was a master's of history in local, regional, and state history.
Okay, and you went to Bridgewater College undergrad. I got on my Bridgewater music shirt today. I
Bridgewater undergrad in history, and then I got my secondary education teaching certificate at James Madison and my master's.
Okay, and I got my master's in school counseling, which describes why I have puppets in my house. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, all right, Nancy, this sounds great, and we're gonna turn it, and we'll be back soon with another continuing episode of this Footnotes in the Valley. So, all right.
Okay, I guess we'll probably continue it after we've gotten a vaccine. I think people like it, so we'll just keep going.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, thanks.